Parliamentarians.
This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Melanie Mehra. I am the Chief Executive of Globe International, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this expert webinar for parliamentarians, which we are hosting as Globe International in our role as the focal point for the UNFCCC for the parliamentary group. We're delighted to be able to welcome a number of expert speakers today. We have just under 1 hour, and I'm very grateful to everybody for joining us at what is a very, very busy time, just 3 days to go to the start of COP28. Now, COP28 is unlike any other COP in two respects as regards parliamentarians. As most of you will know, parliamentarians do not have an official status within the UN system. We are still regarded as non-state actors. We are not a major group. But as a result of advocacy from parliamentary organizations, I'm pleased to report that this year at COP is going to be quite groundbreaking because there are two firsts for parliamentarians. The first is, for the first time, we will have a parliamentary pavilion, a designated hub within the Blue Zone where members of parliament, aides, and others can gather, can collaborate, most importantly, to share strategies to help accelerate ambition, both at home as well as at COP itself. The second is that we will be having a parliamentary day. This is a day which is dedicated to multi-level governance and action. This is on the 6th of December. Towards preparing and supporting parliamentary engagement, both at COP as well as in home parliaments, we have prepared a number of resources. There will be a newsletter issued today, Parliamentarians at COP28. This will be the latest in our year-long newsletters. We have had monthly webinars to prepare parliamentarians for engagement in the COP process. And so today's webinar marks the last one before COP starts. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists that we have with us. We have 4 panelists who are joining us today. The fourth is going to be joining shortly. We have, in no particular order, it's just as I see you on the screen, we have Stientje van Veldhoven, who is from the World Resources Institute. We have Nick Maybe from E3G. I mentioned the two of them first because in previous years, we've had the pleasure of working with WRI and with E3G as our partners, our knowledge partners for these regular parliamentary webinars. We're delighted also to be joined by the Right Honourable Chris Skidmore, Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom. And we will shortly be joined by Amira Saber, who is a Member of Parliament from Egypt. A couple of housekeeping things, as you have already been informed. This meeting is being recorded. We also have closed caption for those of you who require subtitles in your preferred language. So please just look at the bottom of your screen and you will see the offering there for you. So COP28, a great deal of anticipation. Of course, COP has been in the news today, perhaps for the wrong reason by the hosts. We've had the IEA, which has already signaled that this COP, which is a fossil COP, as it's been the shorthand for the last COP in Egypt was the Africa COP. And everybody seems to be referring to the UAE-hosted COP as the fossil COP. The IEA has signaled to the fossil fuel sector that this COP will be a moment of truth for the fossil sector. And of course, as we are to believe the news reports today, the UAE has been involved in using its presidency to promote commercial objective, allegedly. On top of that, the news of the day, of course, there is a myriad of very complex issues with regard to the COP28 agenda. Of course, there are the pillars around climate finance, adaptation, resilience, the loss and damage agenda, in particular under climate finance, and of course, the global stocktake. This year marks the very first time that we have a global stocktake. So without further delving into the arcaneness of the COP institutions and machinery and what awaits us, I would like to call on Nick Maybe to help us set the scene. So the theme for today, of course, is getting ready for COP28, issues, politics, and prospects. And arguably amongst all of us here, Nick has probably been to more COPs than anybody else. So Nick, in your role as a co-chief executive, co-founder of E3G, but importantly, somebody who works with parliamentarians, with politicians, I know you've been doing a lot of briefings in the past few days. If you can help set the scene for members of parliament on what they should expect in the coming days. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Marnie, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. For those of you who have been to lots of COPs, I apologize if anything I'm going to say goes over things you understand, but there's always new people. But I wanted to give a quick overview of, in a sense, the political impact of COP, what this COP needs to agree, and the kind of rhythm of how the whole 2 weeks will play out, no matter which part you're in it. So quite a high-level piece. So COP is, despite some people decrying it, the point for climate change. It's the only time of the year where leaders understand, really have to focus on climate change. 130 are expected in Dubai. The least important thing about COP is that 80,000 people will turn up, because that's still less than most major Comic-Con conventions. But it is the place where the media reports on COP globally. So we see 5 times as much media coverage of climate in the global media, social and traditional, at COP than any other time of the year. So it's a time where climate is above the noise politically in the media, and it's where investors and CEOs turn up to talk about climate. So it sends a really important economic signal to the high points of the economy, public and private, going forward. So it is more than just a negotiation. It is the moment of adjudication and expectation setting for the public, for investors, and for leaders in the year. And you need to think of its outcomes in all of those ways, not just in the formal ways. So what does this COP have to agree? Well, the first thing it has to do is to start the process of meeting the Paris goals. So in Paris, we agreed an overall goal of keeping climate change below 2 degrees and hopefully reaching 1.5. And then countries put their own targets towards it. There was a gap between those two issues, that the overall collective goal and individual targets. The point of Dubai is to look at that, and we know the gap is there. We've had a global stocktake done by the UN. They've shown what that gap is. And now countries need to say what they're going to do to come back in 2025 with targets that bridge that gap as far as possible. So we expect a whole set of course corrections, people call it, or commitments to start that process. And that could include text on what targets should look like in the future, really important for parliamentarians, whole economy targets, greenhouse gas targets, systemic targets. There will be a push on a package of energy commitments, tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, and a process of moving forward. And there will be some commitments on financing. What does that require in terms of investment into countries? So a whole set of commitments, text, perhaps not text, which will be argued over. So the question will be, how strongly are countries saying they're going to bridge the gap between what Paris said it wanted to do and what countries have committed in the next year? The second big bucket is on loss and damage and adaptation and resilience. So we will see the Loss and Damage Fund hopefully established and funded at this COP, which is a big promise which started in Glasgow and needs to be fulfilled. That looks to be going okay. And this COP has to agree a global adaptation goal, which has perhaps been the orphan issue on the table, but is incredibly important. The third bucket is around fossil fuels. As you said, this is a fossil COP. There will be a lot of debate around whether countries are going to commit to phasing down, phasing out fossil fuel use. There's a huge amount of theology about the different bits of ways of language. We also hope to see countries commit to not funding fossil fuels, and the oil and gas industry are going to come forward with pledges of their own for 2030 and reducing emissions. The signals are that will be quite weak. This could be the flashpoint for media and NGO coverage, as we've seen today for the conference. So this is the area which has got most heat around it in terms of attention, but is not the only thing on the agenda. The last area, which is vital, in a sense, isn't on the agenda, but is on the agenda, which is the signal on the momentum in the clean economy. Last year was the first year clean investment outstripped fossil investment globally. This is a year the IEA became much firmer that global emissions from fossil fuels would peak in the next couple of years. China, all the signals are showing that China's emissions may peak in the next couple of years. But a real tipping point where half of Chinese investment went into clean manufacturing this year. So the capacity to deliver the clean economy has grown exponentially, far beyond expectations. And we really do seem to be on the verge of moving forward. There will be 300 initiatives between governments and the private sector and investors launched at COP. Hopefully they will put the kind of proof underneath those trajectories and show we're actually serious about moving even faster than we are going at the moment, with clean investment growing at 30% a year, that there will be accusations of greenwash around those. Some will be better than others, so expect a lot of turmoil. But those are the four buckets: the formal commitments on changing course, targets and funds on adaptation and resilience, fossil fuel commitments, and this kind of broad direction of travel where countries are positioning themselves to be part of the new clean economy. And then I'll finish with just the rhythm of the COP. The COP will start with a fight over the agenda, which is negotiated, because it always does. Hopefully that will be a short-lived piece. Then we'll go straight into the Leaders' Summit over 2 days. This is where we expect leaders to provide political momentum to shape the negotiations. The aim is to have a statement from leaders that shapes the negotiations for the 2 weeks afterwards. Some really important statements we agreed there. Probably the most important at the moment is a leader statement on financial reform of their World Bank and other institutions, which we're expecting the UAE to put out. But this is also where the Israel-Gaza issue may come into COP. And the politics, the difficult geopolitics of the world may come up. So it will be a quite chaotic and intense few days, people fighting over media stories, but it will be highly political. But the aim is that it will send strong signals into the negotiations that will then continue to the weekend and through the weekend. There will be a crisis. There always is a crisis in the middle of COP where people think progress isn't going very far, because obviously negotiators hold out at the beginning of COP, don't show their hand. We will go through that crisis as we always go through to a final package at the end of the week. Our expectations at the moment are we will get more than people think on loss and damage and adaptation. We will get a middling result on the global stock take with some commitment to renewables and energy efficiency goals, perhaps less certainty over directions, over new targets. And there will be an inconclusive fight. We can't really tell what's come out on fossil fuel language and phasing out. But the one thing I can say is the thing about COPs is they're quite powerful spaces that tend to squeeze more politics out of countries than they think they're going to give going in. So we usually get around 20% more if they're well run than we expect. So all eyes are on the UAE presidency to make sure that the multiple forces and energies coming into COP, from governments to civil society to parliamentarians, actually work to drive us to the highest common denominator and not the lowest, because that is generally what COPs do. So they have a bit of magic about them if the presidency does their job right. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Nick. Fantastic. So that's a really helpful overview and a frame, a way of understanding the key issues and how the rhythm is going to be. And you've been quite cautiously optimistic, I think. So helpful to have the scene set. I'm going to move straight to our next speaker. So Chris Skidmore, the Right Honourable Chris Skidmore, Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom, no stranger to COPs, of course. You spent the best part of this year, I think, at Harvard studying every single COP from the very first COP. And of course, you signed into law the United Kingdom's net zero obligation. So Chris, what are your top key issues as you head into COP? Over to you, please. I know also you have to leave very soon, so please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And the work I published as part of a sort of paper for the Harvard Kennedy School focused on where we are now with the COP process. Because COPs 1 to 27 since 1995 have very been much about sort of putting together the final negotiated sort of text. And now that has been completed, bar a few sort of details around certain funds and the amount of investment that will come into those funds in the future, which is obviously, you know, an important consideration for many. Loss and damage fund, international climate finance funds. But at the same time, I see COP28 as being a moment where we move now away from our commitments, our ambition that has been set, not least with the national determined contributions that every country sort of set out at Glasgow and COP26 2 years ago, to now phase 2, which is on implementation and delivery. So the global stocktake that was mentioned earlier, I think, is incredibly important. The Paris Agreement is actually sort of silent on what happens next. So it agreed in the text that we would have a global stocktake. How countries respond to this stocktake is absolutely critical. I think this is an important point for then parliamentarians and legislators to sort of take ownership now of what can happen for the future. Even though we are, as you mentioned, non-state actors, we have a critical role to play in holding our own states to account for the detail that's contained within those national determined contributions. I think 2 years on from Glasgow, many countries came forward to say, we're going to commit to X percentage emissions reduction by 2030. For the UK, we made one of the most ambitious commitments, 68% emissions reduction by 2030. But we've seen that the UK government is still off track to meet that. Our own independent committee on climate change has said we simply don't have the policies in place to even be able to outline how we're going to deliver that beyond 2027. And so there's a real critical role to play, not just at COP28, but also after COP28 in pushing forwards the response to the global stocktake. I hope that at COP28, countries will now come forwards and recognise they've got to provide greater detail for how they're going to deliver on their emissions reductions plan. We've seen, I think, already an international commitment beginning to emerge around a trebling of renewable power by 2030. I think one of those, that's likely now to happen off the back of the China-US summit. What is less clear is what does that mean for national governments? What's your proportion that you might take of renewable power for the future? There'll be some countries with wind and solar that will be really keen to be involved in that. There will be others that are less sort of concerned about sort of their using their available resources towards renewables, but might be more concerned about what does that mean for their existing fossil fuel sort of gas supply. And so trying to understand where we are at the country by country level towards the development of renewables over the next 7 years is going to be really important. And then also we'll see whether we hit this sort of doubling of energy efficiency measures. What does that mean for industry? What does that mean for focusing on residential sort of buildings? And how will that fit into a national determined contribution for each country? I am going to COP having published the net zero review for the British government, which sort of set out in detail what they need to do in order to make their commitments a reality, how to deliver them. And that was published in March of this year. I've actually got it coming out as a paperback ahead of COP, because I want to try to send the message to other countries and other parliamentarians that there's an opportunity for potentially each country to run its own audit and review, to provide more detail around some of the strategies they need, around some of the sub-commitments they need to hit the overall emissions targets. It's all very well having a grand umbrella target for saying this is the amount of carbon dioxide we want to take out of the atmosphere that we're producing, but how are you going to do it? And so for me, the net zero review, Mission Zero was the report. I'm going to try to promote that during Parliament Day. I'm very grateful to global legislators for the opportunity to have a platform on the 6th of December where parliamentarians, I think for the first time, have been given this opportunity to really visibly help shape the narrative, shape the debate. And obviously there is the Parliamentary Assembly also that's taking place on that day as well, which I hope to speak at. So I think there are opportunities for parliamentarians like myself and those on the call today to be involved. But I see the global stocktake as the moment where we can now see what that stocktake sets out, but we can be the catalyst. We can be the ones who really come forward and hold our own governments and our own executives to account on the commitments that then come out of COP28. And obviously, there will then be commitments that we can take forwards into COP29. But critically, obviously, there's that 2-year pathway towards the next Ambition COP in Brazil. So getting commitments about what next is really important. We obviously need to see action happen as soon as possible. But the details that are set out on that pathway on the back of the global stocktake, I hope every parliamentarian can take away and actually go back to their own parliaments, start asking questions, start holding debates on COP28 and the outcomes that we now need to hold governments to account in the future.
Thank you very much, Chris. You've been very clear. The focus on the energy transition, the role of parliamentarians and parliaments in holding governments to account. In 2015, at Paris itself, Globe advocated that parliaments were the best form for accountability. That accountability begins with parliaments, and in particular, the monitoring, review, and the verification mechanisms were entirely suited to the work of scrutiny that parliaments do. You mentioned that preparing for 2030, the next, and of course, the next, the major COP, the Brazilian COP. However, also focusing on implementation of commitments already undertaken. And I should say that all year, And in fact, for the last couple of years, we've been tracking what parliaments have been doing in terms of the role of their committees in holding governments to account. So which parliaments have, right after COP is finished, immediately held a hearing to hear from the governments, well, what did you do? We've been tracking which parliaments have their delegation on formal official delegations. And the good news is that we see more and more official delegations having cross-party members of parliament on them. And the UK most recently has set a very high standard for that, with Minister Graham Stewart having invited a large delegation cross-party of members of select committees on the delegation. Given the hard time that everybody has in getting those very treasured blue zone passes, the best way, of course, is to go on delegations. And this is very important for those members of parliament who are still coming to us and saying, we're not able to get blue zone passes. How do we go to a COP? So a very practical issue. But moving straight ahead to our next speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Amira Sabir, who is a member of parliament for Egypt. And Amira, you hold many roles. We're delighted to be welcoming you as part of the Globe delegation also. But of course, you have a very important role as a bridge between COP27 and COP28. COP27, we work very closely together with you as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee within the parliaments. You had a major focus as the presidency on the global goal on adaptation. So where do you see the successes in terms of that transition between the Egypt's COP and the UAE COP? What are the key positive outcomes for you, and what are the key issues that you will be focusing at in Dubai? Over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today and for holding this important discussion. And I'm very much happy that there would be a place for parliamentarians to have such exchange, because I believe the legislators all around the world has a crucial role to play. If you're talking about green transition, if we're talking about cutting emissions, if we're talking about any of these hardcore issues related to climate change. And, you know, I have an experience myself in Egypt trying to push a draft bill on climate adaptation. And I think the exchanges I had with different parliamentarians from all over the world was very insightful, especially those who share with me the Global South experience or whose countries are kind of having similar conditions to mine. I just overthrew a shadow on the events in Gaza and how I see they are having their overshadow on the next COP, and then directly to your questions, because I think actually COP28 would be very much challenged with crossing like the gap between the north and the south, given the events happening in Gaza, especially that Jordan on the 16th of November refused to sign an anticipated deal with Israel exchanging energy for water. The final actually version of this project was supposed to be signed at COP28. So I hope COP28 would do something with the overshadowing of the events and with such challenges. For the top outcomes of COP27, one of the headline outcomes is establishing a transitional committee that deliberate on the world's first loss and damage fund. And the committee includes 28 members, 10 from the developing countries and 14 from the developed countries, including a representative from the presidents of both COP27 and COP28. And the mandates of the council was articulated about establishing an institutional arrangements, modalities, structure, governance, and terms of reference for the fund, defining the elements of the new funding arrangements, identifying and expanding sources of funding, and ensuring the coordination with the existing funding arrangements. The work of the committee will be concluded upon the ratification of its recommendations at COP28. So there is a very important link here between COP27 and COP28 when it comes to the loss and damage fund, which I actually, after the several bad events and the several natural catastrophes that has been happening last year, I think the loss and damage fund is extremely important in this context. Her Excellency Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, the President Designate of the COP28, has addressed the members of the Transitional Committee, stating that it's one thing to have a well-structured fund, but will only be fully operational if it actually funded. So here it comes how the COP28 in Dubai at the end of the year will place to deliver and operationalize the fund and the funding arrangements for the loss and damage. As of now, the committee has conducted, I believe, like 5 meetings, with the latest held in Abu Dhabi being a breakthrough, as the committee ultimately achieved consensus on providing much needed grant-based support to countries particularly affected by climate change. Nonetheless, the US representative in the committee has expressed concerns about the language of the draft. As a result, we will have to wait and see if the UAE presidency and COP negotiators can successfully persuade the US to support the draft. I think the 1.5 degrees Celsius, keeping the notch on that, is also very much challenged. It's here in Egypt, the beginning of December. We have it happening in few days, yet we are all still wearing like summer clothes. So it's even very much touched by the population all around the world, how the consequences are touching their own lives, how we are very much far from meeting the expectations to stay to the 1.5 Celsius degree. And I think also that the pledges the dialogue and the negotiations about the pledges should continue to run in COP28. COP28 also might explore the option of expanding the fund's scope. The existing support for loss and damage is currently limited to island states and the least developed countries, understandably so. However, if it proves successful, COP28 could extend the access to include other developed nations. The second outcome highlighted by COP27 underscores the imperative to prioritize food security and end hunger in our collective efforts to combat climate change. And I think also this is extremely important because from the Egyptian experience as well, several crops has been affected the last 3 years, specifically with climate change, and we have seen the outcome of this and touched it with the lives of the farmers and how they have suffered with their crops. So food security, I think, is also an issue of concern. In the COP27, this was a breakthrough, since there wasn't the language found before in the COP's documents prioritizing the issue of food security. So that being said, COP27 didn't dedicate any institutional or financial resources to address the issue of hunger. So COP28 holds a historic opportunity to translate this rhetoric into action, specifically benefiting African nations, where 95% of the farmers depend on rainfalls without irrigation systems, leading to hunger and malnutrition during the natural adversities. Climate change impact also on agriculture and food production exacerbates these food shortages, as witnessed in the past 2 years with the suspension of international trade due to COVID-19, resulting in price spikes that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable, with some urban families spending up to 75% of their budget on food. Given that many of the world's hungriest countries rely on agriculture, often dictated by seasonal harvests. December 10th also is the day dedicated by the COP28 presidency to discuss food, agriculture and water, and eagerly anticipating the outcomes of the discussions happening and the agreements among other countries. If there would be some time later on, I would also like to shed the lights on how the dialogue between me and the different parliamentarians from around the world has impacted the draft of the bill, which I introduced to the Egyptian Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amira. Very important points that you've made, in particular raising the issue around food security. And we know that this is just as adaptation, the global goal on adaptation was a key priority for the Egyptian presidency. Food system transformation is a key priority for the UAE presidency. And we know that there has now been a partnership which has been signed up to by many countries. My understanding is that this is from government to government. It will be launched on the 1st of December, the Food Systems Transformation Partnership. So Nick mentioned that we're going to be seeing hundreds of partnerships coming out of COP28. We always do. We know that the focus on non-state actor engagement, in particular private sector partnerships with government, are a very important means of implementation. But the UAE presidency has set the bar extremely high with this figure, Nick, that you've mentioned of 300 partnerships. So the one around food, of course, is just one of them. And of course, there's going to be questions about the delivery of the methane partnership. So let's leave that for our discussion. Amira, definitely there will be time to talk about your personal experiences in drafting the climate change bill for the Egyptian parliament. We heard from Chris, who regrettably, he's had another commitment to leave for. But of course, over the weekend, we celebrated the 15th year anniversary of the UK's Climate Change Act. And that was, in a sense, the gold standard. It was the mother framework act from which so many framework acts on climate change have sought inspiration. But let me move to you, please. Tincha, on this call, we've had 3 members of parliament or former members of parliament. And you are a former member of parliament. You're currently the vice president for Europe at the World Resources Institute, but were formerly a politician and a minister with D66, D66 in the Dutch parliament. So from WRI's perspective, I know you've been focusing a lot on the global stocktake, but if you can share your priorities with us and prospects for the coming few days. Over to you, Tincha.
Yes, happy to do so, and wonderful to be here, Melina, and so important, I think, that you organize these webinars so that we can share our knowledge and insights, and that we can all team up, right, to become even stronger and have a stronger voice in those COPs, so especially parliamentarians. I'll be happy to comment a little bit more in detail on that. Just tell me if you want me to do that in this round or in the second round of questions. But so for WRI, indeed, I think the global stocktake is, of course, the backdrop against which we all set the priorities. And I think Nick already kind of outlined many of those that need to be taken. I think it actually comes together in kind of a rapid response plan. That's actually what we need, right? And that response plan consists in a number of points. And coming back to your point about this being a fossil COP, it would be a fossil COP. It could actually deliver a message on how quickly we're going to phase out or phase down. But of course, let's hope phase out. In any case, shifting away, right? Let's keep that negotiation language of the table for this call. But actually shifting away rapidly from fossil fuels. And if you talk about rapidly and equitably, that also means that, of course, different countries have different responsibilities in that. But that language is going to be super important. And this distinction between phase down and phase out is important also in relationship to the language on CCS. Because you will hear sometimes people speaking wonders about CCS, and it is important. It is going to be part of the mix. I think already for decades, the European Commission scenarios have always shown that CCS was part of the puzzle, but it's only a small part of the puzzle. And therefore, there's no business as usual for any sector. There will have to be really a transition away from those fossil fuels. In any case, a very steep reduction, even if you also develop some CCS for some hard-to-abate sectors. Then, of course, the fully operationalized loss and damage fund. And like Amira said, the transition committee has done amazing work. If you think about COP as also a time and space for political negotiations, then any parliamentarian knows that there is something like political capital that you can, like other capital, spend only once. So if you're spending all your time and your political capital and your energy to get loss and damage one step further, then that kind of takes any other big topic off the table. So it was crucial that this year the transition committee has done really important work to make sure that we've taken large steps in the definition of that loss and damage fund. And then, of course, we need to make sure that the financial pledges are actually also there to make that fund a reality. But hopefully that will leave some space for negotiation, notably on mitigation and the other topics that need to be, where we need to make progress also during the COP. Because we really need to transform key systems, right? Including the energy system by tripling renewable energy, doubling renewable or energy efficiency by 2030. And we want to make sure that this is part of a negotiated outcome, not just a declaration or one of the 300 partnerships, but actually something that the world comes together on and commits to doing. Because all of that will need to be translated then into those new commitments in in answer to the global stocktake, right? Those enhanced nationally determined contributions, but also in financial commitments, right? A new finance goal next year. We've taken far too long, right, to live up to the finance goal that we set. And now we have to set already a new finance goal. And we have to make sure that that's commensurate with the big challenges that we are facing. Maybe two more comments before I conclude. So green industrialization, the investments going in there, I think it was really telling. Africa Climate Summit this summer that kind of offered Africa as a continent of solutions, but not just solutions that are good for Europe or good for China or good for the US. Greening African industrialization means putting the continent on a different pathway and giving the continent a different perspective. And so the inflow of investments into Africa, making sure that Africa gets on a different step in the ladder of adding value and creating higher value jobs on the continent itself is absolutely crucial. And if you think about Europe in relationship to Africa, then of course that is something also where there's a real opportunity to participate and to contribute in a real partnership. Finally, I really agree with Nick on the role of COPs, right? They're not perfect, but they're absolutely the best we have, and they are vital. They're really crucial. My first COP, I'm maybe not such a veteran as Nick, but my first COP was in 2010 in Cancun, and the world was still on a trajectory for 4.6 degrees of global warming. And if you look at even at the very negative report that just came out, we might go to 2.9. That's still about 2 degrees less than where we were in Cancun. And every COP we've gone to was always kind of slightly disappointing in the sense of not delivering the high hopes that we have. But if you look back, we've gone quite high up into the mountain already. And yes, the summit is still far away, and the top, reaching the peak, is harder maybe even than the first part. But we're better trained now. We have all the tools and we have all the technologies that are needed. So what we need is the political will. And that is why the involvement of parliamentarians is so important, and why these moments at COP are so important. These are moments where we bolster our political will, where we see that we're not there alone, that everybody's working on it, and where we can also be called on to take our responsibility, to play our part of the puzzle. And yes, in the developed countries, our responsibility is big, historically, but also still now. If you see our footprint in our current consumption patterns, we have the big burden upon us to make sure that we make a change, and then we can also ask others to change. So specifically, I think parliamentarians also have a great role to play in keeping us honest, because we need to go beyond, let's say, just declarations. We really need to get that into commitments on energy, on let's say overall industry, but also on food, also on transport, also on housing. We can leave no sector untouched. And I feel that yes, food is quite high on the agenda now, but forest, for example, I find gets much too little attention, and so do forests. And I'd also like to see a stronger role for decentralized levels of government, cities, regions. They can play a big role. So I'm happy that you are organizing this event, but that there's also this local climate action summit, because cities and regions, they can step forward, they can step up for their own quality of living in their cities and make a big contribution.
Thank you very much.
Forever, but let's
absolutely. But so let's have a discussion. And I would urge all of those who are on today's webinar, please, the questions and Q&A is open, so please do, I encourage you to share your comments and questions in the chat. But just to pick up, Stientje, you asked us to keep perspective. You know, when Cancun was your first COP, 2010, it came right after the disaster of 2009 in Copenhagen. And Cancun, we had Patricia Espinosa as the host, you know, who later went on, of course, to become the executive secretary. And their expectations were very low. But my first COP was COP 3 in 1997 at Kyoto. And of course, we thought Kyoto was a disaster. And look at the emissions, trajectory that we were looking at then. So even though all of the climate science reports are alerting us that we are on code red right now, it's important to recognize that we have been bending the curve, and we've got a bit more bending of the curve to do and accelerate that. So on that point, the politics around this, Nick, if I can come back to you, and you've seen a lot of this from the inside, the ways in which through bilateral diplomacy, the climate diplomacy is really reshaping the bloc politics that we'd seen in the past, and some interesting alliances have been forged. So what can you share with us in terms of the politics going into the COP?
Lucia just actually talked through a lot of it. The main issue for this COP was, are we going to focus on the money, and particularly for loss and damage, or are we going to focus on mitigation? And I think, with fingers crossed, we will have delivered the 100 billion pledge from Copenhagen. And I think that is reasonably solid, especially as there's an additional 150 billion over 10 years coming through the World Bank because of reforms carried out this year, which is not counted in what's counted in the 100 billion, but is, a lot of that will help on the climate side. And we have already had countries for Germany, Denmark, the European Commission, I think the UK will come forward as well on putting money into the loss and damage fund. They will announce those numbers at the Leaders Summit. So I think we will see money in the loss and damage fund. I don't think there's a huge problem there. And that means focusing on mitigation. And to be honest, it's been quite a tough year. Lots of countries from China to Saudi Arabia to Russia have been very resistant at the G20 and elsewhere to have forward-looking perspectives on phasing down fossil fuels, on meeting 1.5, on committing to ambitious new targets in COP30 in 2 years' time, despite the fact that that's what they signed up to in Paris. There have been accusations of people rolling back the Paris Agreement. Of course, all international agreements are agreed with some ambiguity, as unlike laws, and they tend to be reinterpreted in favor of the ambiguity which suits you most. So the big fight, I think, will be over how strong a signal comes out of COP that we need to correct course and get on track. Everybody can agree we should build more renewables, but what people can't agree on is how fast we cut emissions. Those things are obviously connected, but as China shows, you can be building lots of coal power stations and be the largest renewable investor in the world at the same time. So that's where a lot of the climate politics are. And, everybody said it's been quite a tough year. So there's a reason I remain optimistic is that the broader mood music is quite good. So the Biden-Xi meeting means that for their own domestic reasons, the US and China have decided to enter into a détente type situation. And they both know that other countries value climate action so much is either of them is seen as blocking, that will reflect on them geopolitically. So that's a good dynamic. That's a dynamic we can work with. And we hope to see China coming forward with more, because the Chinese analysis shows it should be peaking in a few years' time. So they should feel they have the freedom to move and it aligns with their economic goals, not just their climate goals. I think we hope to see more language in terms of the North-South tensions of development finance. COP should send a very strong message to the World Bank and the IMF and other institutions that in order to do climate action, countries need action on debt. They need action on access to finance. Low-income countries have not managed to issue a single sovereign bond this year. So how can they invest in adaptation or in renewables when they can't raise money from international capital markets? So that's a macroeconomic issue. It's nothing to do with climate, but it's everything to do with climate. So I think that's one of the issues we'll see actually quite a lot of alignment around. So that, though North-South politics on money often tension, I think actually we're seeing some high-level agreement. The one area I worry about is actually trade. Because one of the promises that made countries like Indonesia and South Africa commit to go net zero, the more industrialized middle-income countries, was they thought they'd get a slice of this new economy. But with China and the US and Europe, to be honest, pumping subsidies into their industries in order to capture these markets, it looks like there's no space for anybody else, including actually countries like the UK and Japan, who are quite wealthy. So I think this issue will bubble up in the sidelines. It's already bubbling at the WTO. The number of complaints about green measures has gone up by around 5-fold this year. That how do we have a level playing field, a fair sharing of the benefits of transition? But the very fact that we're talking about sharing the benefits of this transition is such a move from the previous narrative of how do we allocate burdens. So I feel that is a solvable set of politics, but it's a new political dynamic that's coming because of the amazing success of the technology and the finance of driving what's now seen as an inevitable transition by the private sector everywhere in the world. No one is betting against the low carbon transition. The only question is how fast and who benefits.
Thanks a lot, Nick. And as you say, the real economy is moving much faster than the realpolitik on this. Thank you for mentioning trade, because I'd like to do a little plug, because at the Parliamentary Pavilion, we actually are going to be hosting a briefing by the man who's helping the head of the World Trade Organization rethink a sustainable trade system, which is compliant with a climate safe future and net zero commitment. So we're going to be examining this issue very closely because, as you say, the debate's moving past burden sharing to benefit sharing. How can those who have created dominant economic positions through support for their green sectors, how can we let others into the global marketplace who are still at a much more, they're on the foothills and not the peaks, to use your analogies, teacher. So let's come back to you, please, Amira, because of course we're focused very much on what parliamentarians can do about all of this. It's a very complex agenda that you meet when you come to COP28. It's very easy to be befuddled and bedazzled by all of what's going on. And so far, we've really remained within the tracks of the official agenda. But we know there's a lot of stuff going on in the blue zone, but there's even more stuff going on in the green zone. So there's a lot of noise. How do you keep focus? So, Amira, I'd like to come back to you and pick up on where we left off last year. When we left you in Cairo and you went back to the parliament, what were your next steps?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very important question. I think one of the great things which I got to know now, since I have attended the last 3 COPs, is that there is a place for parliamentarians to meet each other. Because actually in such a vast and diversified, very quick, very condensed program of COP, it's not very easy that parliamentarians find each other. I kept just like following the tweets of parliamentarians who are in COP and send them foreign exchange, and it wasn't that easy. So I really wish that global legislators would do as much publicity as possible about the existence of their pavilion and its exact place, because I think that one of the very important things that should happen between parliamentarians from the global north and the global south is coming on a common ground. Because when I see the legislations coming about cutting the emissions to zero in some advanced European countries, it's a total different priority from mine. Even if I try to introduce this in my context, I still have an economy which is very much suffering the consequences of the economic crisis. So I wouldn't be like very much up to the pace of what is happening in my country if I don't tailor what the global legislators have been introducing to this space. This is one. Another thing is that I think also by the power of law, there should be a kind of consensus on the importance of technology transfer, because overseeing the global south up till now, there is no such transfer of knowledge, either through the cooperation between the North and South universities, or even through the mega manufacturing and industrial applications. All what's happening now is that we are receiving grants. For example, I'm stating that we are receiving grants toward this green transition. Egypt has a massive potential with green hydrogen, but grants alone is not gonna give you the full infrastructure on that. You need technology transfer. You really need legislative framework on how this could work and how to find, for example, carbon credit markets. Up till now, we don't have this in Egypt. There are trials. But what is really important is that the local policymakers would be tuned to the urge of how they help their countries through their parliaments to move forward the interventions. Because in my country, for example, the pace of the government is much faster than the pace of the legislators. So I have seen lots of mutual cooperations, lots of actually funds or whatever cooperative programs being signed by my government, but on another level for proper implementation. So at least I would, as a parliamentarian, oversee and perform my oversight tools to check if these funds have been used properly, if actually the mega national plans for urban planning, for whatever, are really being placed, given into consideration that climate change is happening too. Because I think up till now, many countries are suffering that their national plans for development are not tuned to the climate change priorities. So we are building cities in places that could be actually flooded by the water. Moving on, this is waste of resources. This is a kind of not proper management, poor management. So this needs a kind of collaboration. And it's very important to find maybe a platform, maybe a way to get the dialogue running between parliamentarians whose countries share the same conditions. Because yes, sometimes it's very progressive to see, for example, an AI legislation which is placed by the EU. But now when I tailor this, where I don't have the AI infrastructure in my country, there is hell of gap. This is totally different from running a conversation with closer countries from the global south who share my experience, who share my conditions, who could, because I have been asked about my bill in too many countries, Arab countries, countries with similar economic conditions, and they shared me their experiences on how to tailor what is being mentioned in my bill to their national priorities. This is having a real gap because I didn't find frequently such dialogues happening at all. And I think that the UN agencies up till now are really failing to put parliamentarians into the loop of the communications properly. This is a wealth of movement that could actually be placed in the space for fighting or dealing with climate change, and up till now I see it's not used at all, not even at the global north. There is still the majority of the parliamentarians around the world are not into the cycle of action when it comes to climate change. They are not well briefed. They are not enlightened about the latest in the negotiations, the latest in the spheres of what has been happening in the past COPs. So I myself founded an NGO in Egypt fully dedicated to cross this gap between policymakers and between the academia and between the other NGOs, because it makes all the difference to tailor the solution to your local narrative, to find the people at the villages, interventions to fight climate change that fits the challenges which they see, but actually not to just spend money on interventions, on ratifications, on exchanges and agreements which are not very much relevant to the local context where they should be spent. So other than the funding and the pledges are not met, even the met ones I see are not being channeled into the very proper channels because they are not.
Yeah. So, Amira, thank you so much. I think you've made a very powerful case for why parliamentarians need to have their awareness raised about the dynamics of these international debates, but also at a very pragmatic level, be involved in a much more effective way in national development planning, so that the plans that you're talking about can be climate-proofed. Of course, you've also made a very strong case for why the work of organizations like Globe are so essential. I would invite you and all who are on this call and who see the recording later to come to the Parliamentary Pavilion, which will be in the Blue Zone. There we will be showcasing the work that we have done with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, where we examine the climate change laws and policies of 55 member governments of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. We'll be hearing from members of parliament from Nigeria and South Africa on how they are focusing their efforts on a just transition in the South African context. In Nigeria, how Nigeria, an oil-producing country, managed to put net zero legislation and commitment in its national climate change law. That was a piece of work sponsored by a Globe legislator. So there's a lot to share and to take heart from, but we literally have just a few minutes, and I would like to just have a quick round. Stientje, Nick, your final thoughts, your key messages. Stientje, I know that in the European context, of course, there is still a great deal of asymmetry between the EU 27 countries, but the European Parliament has come out with a very strong statement for COP28. So how optimistic are you feeling about parliamentary engagement to help ratchet upwards the ambition that Nick was talking about?
Well, I'm in that sense very ambitious. I'm optimistic in the sense that I hope that parliamentarians will show a lot of ambition, and basically in all three phases, right? Prepare yourself well for COP. Make sure you know. You ask your government about the latest state. Make sure that you participate when you're there in the briefings, and make sure that you exchange also through, for example, the parliamentary pavilion, knowledge with other parliamentarians. What have you heard? Are the negotiations going? And to jointly put that pressure on those governments so that we maximize that political space that Nick was talking about. That is why these countries come together. Negotiations is always about trying to push everybody just a little bit further. And if 180 countries do that, we can really make a significant step. And parliamentarians should be there to put the pressure on their governments to make sure that they maximize this political step. And then finally, of course, follow up. When you come back home after the COP, right, the Monday morning meeting should be, what is the target that my government signed up to, which I am going to follow as a parliamentarian? Every time that I speak to the government about climate, adopt one of the promises, adopt one of the commitments, and make sure you follow up, dig in, keep them accountable, and make sure progress is being made. And if parliamentarians start doing that more, right, then we can even be more of a force for power. And through these kind of networks, sharing also how you can be successful, I think that can even, with my optimism, right, that can even give it a further impulse, which I think really, really badly needed. We are all needed to make this work. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So COP hasn't started, but we've given our parliamentarians their homework. And what we are also telling them is that when you come back, organize that hearing in Parliament so that people like Nick who go to these select committee hearings can tell that what the government actually did. So Nick, you've got the final thoughts on this.
Yes. So again, I think parliamentarians, again, COP will be COP, but question is we need to come out of COP with the right messages and doing our work for the future. The first thing parliamentarians need to go back and say to their constituents and the executive, take COP30 seriously. What we agree in COP30 will determine the temperatures we have to live with for the next 100 years. So there is no more space, there is no more time. It really is. So if you want to take 1.5 or 2 degrees off the table, don't invest. So you've got to do that. The second point is to say that means all governments need to invest in a diplomacy to build the conditions for that. And that's not all at COP. There's also in the international finance reform. It's in working together on energy, on trade, and they're not. So you hold the executive to account and say, how are you helping this agreement come together? Putting pressure on some people, collaborating with other people, where are you putting your investment? And the last piece is, as I just said, it's building that national plan. And again, this is not just numbers and targets. That was the old game. This is about, as we talked about, how do we maximize the benefits to our population of this incredible technological revolution, which is underway and accelerating? How do we protect everybody, including the most vulnerable people and communities? And how do we actually transform our national institutions so they're fit for purpose in this new world? No one is going to thrive in a climate changed world and a zero carbon economy based on the institutions and companies of the past. It is a transformational agenda. It should be something that animates and gives people purpose to drive forward rather than, again, seen as a burden. And I think that's where parliamentarians taking that positive message back, but also the warning, complacency is not an option for anybody. And that's something we need to drive home so that people actually put in the work to make sure that we do course correct, come out of COP, course correct, and agree a sustainable pathway in a COP30 in 2025.
Thanks very much, Nick, to yourself, to Steensha, to Amira, to Chris in absentia, to everybody who's joined us on the call today. A reminder that we will be there, of course, in the Parliamentary Pavilion at COP28, but very importantly, we will be live streaming on the Globe International YouTube channel so that you can participate and you can also bring those debates directly into your own constituency offices and your parliamentary offices. So thank you once again. It's a big but less complex agenda, I think, after today's webinar. We look forward to hearing your thoughts during the course of the coming 2 weeks and to inviting you back to share your reflections on what happened. But from us at Globe International, thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. Thank you all. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks to you for organizing.